It was a typical day when everything changed. My heart raced as I heard the tires of my child's wheelchair screech across the pavement, followed by the unmistakable sound of a loud thud. The cops in the HOA uniforms didn't know the truth. They had just knocked my child's wheelchair over. But what they didn't know was that I was ex-law enforcement, a former officer who had dealt with situations much more dangerous than this. This wasn't just an accident. It was the moment my world collided with a shocking twist. How would I respond? Was this the final straw that would make me reveal who I really was? The stakes were higher than they could imagine, and the consequences were about to unfold. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind where the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow on everything it touched. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. It was one of those days where the world seemed to slow down, and everything felt just right. I had just finished running a few errands, and decided to take my child to the park for a bit of fresh air. My child, who was in a wheelchair, had always loved the outdoors, and I made it a point to get them out as often as I could. We were enjoying the quiet moments, with me pushing the chair along the smooth park path, and them laughing as they pointed out squirrels and birds. Everything felt calm, serene, and exactly as it should be. As we neared the park entrance, I noticed two vehicles parked nearby, their black and white HOA patrol cars sitting in a stark contrast to the tranquil surroundings. I'd seen them before, always patrolling the neighborhood with their authority-fueled presence, making sure everyone adhered to the homeowners association rules. These were not real law enforcement officers, but they sure acted like they were. I wasn't fond of them, but I didn't usually have any problems. I always followed the rules. My child had every right to be here, just like anyone else. But there was something about the presence of those cars that immediately set me on edge. The first sign of trouble came when I heard one of the officers call out to me. I looked up to see two men in crisp uniforms walking toward us with that all-too-familiar air of superiority. They didn't look like typical patrol officers, their uniforms bearing the HOA insignia rather than any real law enforcement agencies. I could sense the tension in the air as they made their way to us, the sound of their boots on the pavement, steady and deliberate. "We need you to move," one of them said curtly, his tone more commanding than necessary. He didn't even offer a greeting, just the words I had heard far too many times from people who thought they had power. "This is a restricted area. You can't park here." I stared at him for a moment, confused and slightly irritated. "What do you mean?" I asked, gesturing to the open space in front of us. "This is a public park. There's no sign saying we can't park here." The officer's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, taking in the peaceful scene around him. There was no reason for us to be moved. I could see my child's face starting to shift from playful curiosity to concern as they looked at the men standing in front of us. Something wasn't right. But at that moment, I wasn't sure what it was. "You heard me," the officer replied, more forcefully this time. "Move along. There are other spots in the park." I was taken aback. My blood began to simmer. The disrespect in his voice, the way he was speaking to me and my child, it was too much. Was this how they treated everyone? I couldn't understand it. The park was empty, and there was no reason for them to act like this. The officer's companion stood silently, not making eye contact, his posture stiff and defensive. The two of them seemed to think they had all the authority in the world, and they were hell-bent on enforcing it, regardless of the circumstances. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "There's no need to be rude," I said, my voice steady but firm. "We're just here to enjoy the park. We're not causing any trouble." The officer didn't even flinch. Instead, he took a step closer to us, his eyes flicking to my child in the wheelchair, who was now fidgeting uneasily. He looked down at my child for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak or not. It felt like time slowed down. My chest tightened, and my mind raced. Something was off about this whole situation, and then it happened, something I never could have anticipated. Without warning, the officer reached forward, grabbing the armrest of my child's wheelchair. In one swift motion, he pushed it, sending the chair toppling over. My child screamed, the sound echoing through the park, sending a shockwave of panic through my entire body. I watched in horror as the wheelchair hit the ground, the wheels screeching, and my child fell, their small body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went still. My heart stopped. My vision blurred as anger and panic surged within me. My child's frightened cries rang in my ears, and all I could think about was getting to them. I rushed forward, kneeling by their side, my hands trembling as I helped them sit up. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice thick with concern. They nodded, tears streaming down their face. I turned toward the officers, my blood boiling. How dare they? How could they do something like this? My mind screamed for answers, but none came. They had just knocked my child to the ground, and I was too shocked to process it fully. The officer who had pushed the wheelchair stood there looking at me as if he hadn't just committed a grievous act. His partner, the one who had remained quiet, stepped forward but said nothing. You just knocked my child's wheelchair over," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "How could you?" The officer finally seemed to register the gravity of what had just happened. He glanced at his partner, who remained silent before turning back to me. "It was an accident," he muttered, his tone now laced with uncertainty. An accident? My entire body quaked with fury. I stood up slowly, my gaze never leaving the officers. "Accident?" I repeated, my voice cold, dangerously calm. "You've just knocked my child over and you call that an accident?" I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I knew that wasn't the answer. I had to remain in control for my child's sake. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to slide. Not this time. They had crossed a line and I wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that I wasn't just some helpless parent. I wasn't the kind of person who would sit back and let something like this slide. I had a history they didn't know about, one that made me far more than just a bystander in this situation. I was ex-law enforcement, and this was far from over. The air around us seemed to thicken, and the previously calm park environment felt suddenly suffocating. My heart raced, but I kept my composure. I had to stay calm. For the sake of my child, who was still sitting on the ground, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I helped them back into the wheelchair, making sure they were steady before gently brushing their tears away. I couldn't let them see the anger that burned within me, but deep inside, my blood was boiling. I glanced up at the two officers who were standing just a few feet away, watching me closely. They were no longer as assertive as before. Their demeanor had shifted, and I could tell they were realizing they had pushed things too far. But it wasn't enough for me to merely be angry or upset. No, this was a moment of reckoning, not just for them, but for everyone who thought they could abuse their so-called authority without consequences. With a deep breath, I stood up slowly, making sure to keep my posture straight and my eyes locked with theirs. I could feel their eyes on me, but they were unsure now, almost hesitant. They didn't know what they were dealing with, but I was about to show them. "You don't know who you're dealing with," I said, my voice steady, my tone colder than I intended. It wasn't a shout, just a simple statement that carried the weight of years of experience. I could see the confusion flicker across their faces, their brows furrowing as they tried to process my words. But the moment they looked into my eyes, I saw it. The fear. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it in the way their shoulders tensed and how they exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't recognize me at first, but it was becoming clear to them now that I wasn't just any parent. I wasn't someone they could easily push around. This wasn't just a routine encounter. This was about to escalate into something they couldn't control. I took a step toward them, every inch of me commanding their attention. The space between us felt like an eternity, but the tension between us was palpable. I was standing taller, now, not just as a concerned parent, but as someone who had seen things they could never even imagine. The wheels in my head were turning. I wasn't going to let them get away with this, not without facing some serious consequences. I'm not just some angry parent you can intimidate, I continued, my voice unwavering. The words were deliberate, sharp, and unmistakable. I'm a former law enforcement officer. I've spent years handling situations like this, high-pressure moments with real consequences, and you've just made a massive mistake. I could see their expressions shift as the realization dawned on them. Their faces paled and their bodies froze for a moment. The facade of authority they had been wearing began to crumble. They were no longer the ones in control of the situation. Now, it was me. They were up against someone who had the experience, the knowledge, and the resolve to hold them accountable. The taller officer, who had been the one to push my child's wheelchair, took a step back, as if he was suddenly uncertain of how to proceed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His partner, the one who had been standing silent, looked between me and the officer, his eyes wide, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. But it didn't matter. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. I took a deep breath, trying to control the surge of emotions that were threatening to explode. You've made a grave mistake, I said, my voice low and controlled, but carrying the weight of years of training. And now you'll see what happens when you mess with the wrong person. The tension hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The officers stood still, their eyes flickering between me and my child. They had pushed too far, and now they were standing in the aftermath of their actions, realizing that the consequences were far greater than they had imagined. The officer who had pushed the wheelchair finally spoke, his voice weak. Look, we didn't mean for this to happen. It was just a mistake. His words were rushed, desperate, as though he was trying to salvage whatever remained of his dignity, but it was too late. The apology felt hollow, and I wasn't interested in hearing it. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone with a few words. You don't get to apologize and walk away from this, I said firmly, crossing my arms over my chest. You've assaulted my child. You've put them in harm's way, and I won't just let that go. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here today. The officer's eyes widened in realization. It wasn't just about the immediate moment anymore. It was about the long-term consequences of their actions. They had underestimated me, assuming they could intimidate a parent and get away with it. But now they were facing something much bigger: accountability. I wasn't going to let them slip away quietly into the background. No, they were going to face the repercussions, and I wasn't backing down. I reached for my phone and began recording. The sound of the camera clicking on seemed to amplify the tension in the air. I wasn't just documenting what had happened, I was building a case. Everything they did, every word they said from here on out would be on record. They had no idea what they were in for. You're going to have to answer for this, I said, holding the phone up between us, and I'm going to make sure of it. The officers exchanged glances again, but this time there was no confidence in their eyes. They were defeated, and it was clear they knew their game was up. The realization had fully settled in. They weren't dealing with someone they could bully into submission. They were dealing with someone who had the power to expose them for what they were, nothing more than people who had abused a position of authority. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for them. They had no idea what they had just walked into. But that fleeting pity quickly dissipated. What mattered now was justice. My child deserved it. I deserved it. And I was going to make sure that no one ever had to go through what we had just experienced. The silence that followed was thick, with tension. No one moved. The park around us seemed to fade away, leaving just the three of us in a world of my making. I wasn't backing down. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. And soon enough, they would realize just how serious I was. The next steps were clear. I would file a report. I would make sure this incident was known. And I would follow through, no matter how long it took. I wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. The tension in the air was palpable. The two officers, once standing tall with the self-assurance of people who believed they were in control, were now visibly unsettled. I could see the subtle shift in their posture, the stiffening of their backs, the nervous glances exchanged between them. They were no longer the imposing figures they had been earlier, strutting around with the authority of their uniforms. Now they were the ones on the defensive. And I could feel the power shift in the air, a force I had worked years to perfect as a former law enforcement officer. But this was different. This wasn't just about the authority of a badge or a uniform. It was about doing what was right. I didn't say another word immediately. I simply took out my phone and began snapping pictures of the scene. The click of the camera felt almost loud in the otherwise still park, but it was the sound of accountability being set in motion. I zoomed in on the officers' faces, capturing their discomfort, their uncertainty. I documented the position of the wheelchair, the broken pieces of its structure, and most importantly, the look of fear in my child's eyes as they clutched onto my arm, still shaken from the fall. I was building a case, and I knew that every detail, every photo, and every second of this interaction could be used to hold these officers accountable. I could hear the murmurs of the small crowd that had gathered, their voices hushed but filled with curiosity. They were watching the scene unfold, sensing that something was wrong. And I knew that in the next few moments, their perception of the situation would change. This wasn't just some minor disagreement. This was an abuse of power. The officers had crossed a line, and now the entire park was witness to it. "Do you realize how serious this is?" I asked, my voice cutting through the air with a quiet but commanding authority. My words hung in the air, demanding an answer. The officers were visibly taken aback, their eyes darting between me, my child, and the gathering crowd. They weren't sure what to do next. I could see the hesitation in their eyes. Realization was beginning to set in. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were starting to understand that they had made a dangerous mistake. And they had no one to blame but themselves. The officer who had pushed my child's wheelchair stepped back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Look, it was an accident," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. The words felt weak, almost hollow, and I could tell that even he knew it wasn't going to be enough. It was too late for apologies now. What had happened here wasn't just an accident. It was a violation of my trust, my child's safety, and the basic principles of respect and decency. "An accident?" I repeated, my voice now edged with a steely calmness. "Do you know how reckless that was? You knocked my child over, and you're calling it an accident? You don't get to walk away from this with a simple excuse." I could feel my pulse quicken, but I kept my tone steady. This wasn't about losing control. It was about making them understand that they couldn't get away with what they'd done. The second officer, the one who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was softer, laced with uncertainty. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, almost pleading. "We thought the area was reserved. We were just doing our job, trying to enforce the rules." "You thought the area was reserved?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I took a step closer, my stance unwavering. "You honestly believe you had the right to treat us like this? To knock over a child's wheelchair and claim you were just doing your job?" My words were firm, every syllable a sharp reprimand that cut through the air. They looked at each other, unsure how to respond. It was clear that they hadn't expected this kind of resistance. In their minds, they had power. Power that came from their uniforms, power that came from the authority they believed was granted to them. But that power was crumbling now, piece by piece, as they realized that not all authority figures could be challenged and manipulated so easily. As the crowd continued to watch, I could see more people gathering, some of them now pulling out their phones to document the interaction. The officers could no longer rely on their usual intimidation tactics. They had to face the reality that they were being exposed, and exposure in this case was exactly what they deserved. "Do you think this is just going to disappear?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "You can't just walk away from this. You can't pretend it never happened. You've assaulted my child, and you'll be held responsible. I'm filing a report, and I will make sure this goes further than just this park." There was a moment of silence as the officers absorbed my words. The tension in the air was thick now, and I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them. They were cornered. They couldn't escape this, no matter how hard they tried. I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't going to back down. The officer who had pushed my child finally took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. He knew it was over. He could no longer pretend that what he had done was acceptable. "Please," he said, almost pleading now. "We didn't mean for this to happen. We'll make it right. We'll pay for the damages, whatever it takes." I shook my head, refusing to accept his words. "It's not about paying for damages," I said, my voice steady. "It's about accountability. You need to answer for your actions. You need to understand the weight of what you did, and you need to be held responsible." At that moment, I made my decision. I wasn't just going to let this incident be swept under the rug. I wasn't going to let them walk away thinking they could just apologize and make everything go away. I pulled up the app on my phone and began typing out a report, documenting everything that had just transpired. I wasn't just going to report the incident to the HOA. No, this was going to the proper authorities. This was going to be a legal matter, and they were going to be held accountable for their reckless behavior. The officers watched in silence as I typed, their eyes shifting nervously from one another to me. It was clear they understood that the situation had spiraled beyond their control. This wasn't just a simple case of enforcing rules. It was a violation of trust, a breach of safety, and an abuse of authority, and they were going to pay for it. The crowd around us grew, some of them nodding in agreement with my actions. Others whispered to one another, clearly shocked by what they had witnessed. A few people even came forward, offering their support, asking if they could help in any way. It was comforting to know that the community was standing with us, but I knew the battle wasn't over. It had just begun. "Do you understand now?" I asked, looking directly at the officers. They didn't respond immediately, but their silence spoke volumes. They knew they had been caught, and now they were at my mercy. But I wasn't the type to show mercy to those who had wronged my child. Justice, I had learned in my years of service, was about standing firm in the face of wrongdoing, no matter how difficult the fight. "I will be following through with this," I said firmly, ending the conversation. "This is just the beginning," and with that, I turned and walked away, the sound of my child's wheelchair wheels scraping against the pavement behind me. I knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long, hard road ahead. But I was ready for it. For my child. For justice. For the accountability that had been so long denied. The dust had settled after the confrontation, but the anger and disbelief still simmered beneath the surface. The officers, once so confident in their authority, were now left with nothing but their own shame and regret. It wasn't enough for them to apologize or try to explain themselves away. No, this was bigger than that. What had happened wasn't just a simple mistake. It was an abuse of power, a violation of trust, and a disregard for my child's safety. And as much as I wanted to move on, to let the incident fade away, I knew that would not be possible. Not when it had shaken me to my core, and certainly not when it had left my child scarred in ways that words couldn't express. After the initial shock wore off, I took immediate action. I wasn't just going to walk away from this. I filed a formal report with the HOA, detailing everything that had happened. The officers' reckless behavior, the way they had disregarded our rights, and the trauma they had caused. I wasn't just going to let this be swept under the rug as a one-off mistake. This had to be addressed, and the officers involved had to be held accountable for their actions. But I knew that wouldn't be enough either. It wasn't just about punishing them. It was about preventing something like this from ever happening again. I pushed for a full investigation into their conduct. I demanded to know how these officers had been hired in the first place. What kind of background checks had been done, if any? How had they been allowed to hold positions of authority without any real qualifications or oversight? The more I dug, the more I uncovered. It became clear that the HOA board had no idea who they were employing, and that's when the real shock set in. They had no idea what kind of people they had entrusted with power, and when that information got out, it sent ripples through the community. The news spread like wildfire. The incident quickly became the talk of the neighborhood, and soon it wasn't just about what had happened to my family. It was about the fundamental problem with the HOA's hiring practices. People were outraged. How could the HOA allow such unqualified, unprofessional individuals to patrol their streets? How could they trust people who had no respect for the residents they were supposed to serve? It wasn't long before other families came forward with their own stories, some even revealing similar incidents of mistreatment at the hands of these so-called cops. It wasn't just my family who had been affected. It was everyone who had come into contact with these officers, and it was becoming clear that this had been a systemic issue. As the community rallied together, demanding action from the HOA, I couldn't help but feel a sense of validation. I had done the right thing. I had stood up for my child, for my family, and for the entire neighborhood. But it wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about making sure that no other parent, no other child would have to go through what we had. The anger I had felt in those first few moments of the confrontation was now replaced with determination. I had a mission now, and it wasn't going to end until justice had been served. In the days that followed, the HOA board convened to discuss the issue. I was contacted by a few concerned residents who had followed the situation closely and wanted to know what they could do to help. They were horrified by what had happened and wanted to ensure that the officers involved were held accountable. They, too, were willing to demand answers from the HOA, and their support only fueled my resolve. When the HOA board finally released a statement, it was clear that they had been forced to take action. The two officers had been removed from their positions, their contracts terminated with immediate effect. The HOA promised to conduct a full review of their hiring practices, vowing to put in place stricter measures for vetting future personnel. They even publicly apologized, though. To be honest, the apology felt hollow. It wasn't enough to simply remove a few bad apples and promise to do better. What happened that day wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem. The real change needed to come from the top down, and the HOA had a long way to go before they could regain the trust of the community. For me, the battle wasn't over. I continued to push for deeper reforms, demanding that the HOA provide more transparency in their operations and more accountability to the people they were supposed to serve. I wasn't about to let the incident be buried or forgotten. It wasn't just about what had happened to me. It was about making sure the HOA learned from its mistakes and put in place real, lasting changes. I started a petition urging other residents to sign on in support of sweeping reforms to the HOA's practices. I didn't want this to be a one-time event where people were outraged for a week and then moved on with their lives. This needed to be a wake-up call for the entire community, one that would spark a long-term commitment to transparency, fairness, and respect. The petition gained traction quickly, and soon there were hundreds of signatures from residents who were just as fed up as I was. As I watched the changes unfold, I couldn't help but think back to that moment in the park. The moment when I had to make a decision. I had a choice. I could have let it slide. I could have accepted the apology. And I could have walked away. But that would have been the easy thing to do. The right thing was to stand up for my child, for my family, and for the community. And in doing so, I had made a difference. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The officers were gone. The HOA was on notice, and the community had come together to demand better. But there was still work to be done. I knew that. But I also knew that if we all stood together, we could make sure that what happened to us didn't happen to anyone else. In the end, this story was more than just about the mistakes of two officers. It was about the power of standing up against injustice, the strength of a community coming together, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. It was a reminder that, no matter how small or insignificant a moment may seem, standing up for what's right can change everything. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority or injustice, remember that you have the power to make a change. Stand up, speak out, and demand accountability. Join the conversation and subscribe to the HOA stories for more real life. Tales of community, accountability, and standing up for what's right. Together, we can make our neighborhoods safer, stronger, and more just for everyone.